Hello, everyone, and welcome to our final day of MEI Climate Week 2023. Again, my name is Mohammed Mahmoud. I'm the director of the Middle East Institute's Climate and Water Program. And today's final theme and topic is focusing on climate resilience and sustainability in cities. Cities and urban environments are one of our frontiers in terms of addressing and combating the climate crisis. A large segment of our human populations reside there. A lot of the services that support these human populations are centered around cities and urban environments. And cities themselves also experience particular impacts of climate change as it relates to the provision of these services, both on the water utility and environmental side. Therefore, these areas and cities and urban environments play a role in addressing the climate crisis and improving and incorporating climate resilience measures, innovative solutions to mitigate against and adapt to the effects of climate change. And aspects such as green infrastructure, urban agriculture, and many others are avenues in which this type of progressive adaptation can take place. So let me not speak further on that and leave that to our esteemed panel of experts. But before I dive in, I'll introduce, before they commence with the discussion, I'll introduce the moderator for the panel today. The moderator is Steve Kenny. Stephen Kenny is the director of the Middle East Institute's Strategic Foresight Initiative program. He's also the founder and principal of Foresight Vector LLC, which is an advisory firm that's aimed at helping organizations to develop strategies to improve and achieve their success. His work includes advisory engagements for top executives in Fortune 500 and other leading corporations, as well as leaders in government and governmental agencies, both domestically and abroad. Stephen's work at MEI focuses around using real-time global political analysis to help develop methodology that soundly approaches and helps decision makers chart a successful course forward. So with that very brief introduction, I'll hand it over to Stephen to lead our panel discussion and introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Mohammed. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm very excited to hear from our speakers. Let me first introduce them, and then I'll provide a little bit of information to all of you in the audience. We have with us today first Karim Gundi. Karim is he's an urban sustainability and climate consultant based in London. He's the founder and coordinator of Karbon, which is an advocacy initiative promoting sustainability in the cities of the Middle East and North Africa. He is also an associate director at Bureau Happold, an associate fellow at Chatham House with the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and a non-resident scholar here at Middle East Institute. Currently, his work is focusing largely on the Middle East and North Africa, especially around the Eastern Med and the Gulf. But in over 2 decades of doing this kind of work, he has considerable experience working as well in Europe, North America, and Sub-Saharan Africa. In 2013, he was the recipient of the Global Green Building Entrepreneurship Award from the World Green Building Council, and he's also a chartered member of the Royal Institute of British Architects. Karim, it's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you for having me.
Next, we have Jamila Elmir. Jamila is a senior advisor with the High Level Climate Champions. She has over 15 years of experience in environmental and sustainability strategy and policy development on a wide range of topics, including large-scale infrastructure development, master planning and citywide planning, climate change, and urban waste systems. Most recently, Jamila was serving as the technical strategy and policy advisor for environment and sustainability with the government of Dubai. And prior to that, she has held several positions in the private sector in city advisory and consulting companies. Jamila, it's a pleasure to have you here today as well.
Thank you, Stephen.
And we also have with us today Shruti Narayan. She is the regional director for South and West Asia at C40. She's based in New Delhi, India, and she works closely with the city leadership in New Delhi to sustain and scale up C40's efforts in the region. Prior to her role there at C40, she was an officer with the International Finance Corporation's Asia Pacific Cities platform, and she also led IFC's Green Building Program in South Asia. Other experience that she has includes with the Will Alsop Architects in London, with Arup in San Francisco, and with USAID in New Delhi, working with corporations and developers, institutions, policymakers, and donor agencies. She's also been a faculty member in sustainable design at Stanford University, at the California College of Arts, and the School of Planning and Architecture in India. Shruti, it's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you, Stephen.
For the members of our audience, we'll be talking here with our panelists for about an hour, roughly. I have some questions that I'll be posing to them, and we'll also give you the opportunity to add questions that you would like toward the end of our program that I can pose to the panelists. There is a Q&A button on your Zoom. If you would use that, please, and you can use that at any time during the discussion to post your questions. And as time allows, we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. So with that, let's jump in. Jamila, I'd like to start with you if I can. So urbanization is projected to increase rapidly to the point where by 2050, approximately 2/3 of the world's population will be living in cities. The already large and mega cities will be obviously part of that expansion. But many small and medium-sized cities are also set to experience rapid growth. I'd love to hear from you on what's the most essential thing that planners and leaders can do to get out in front of that so that we ensure that the expansion of these currently smaller and medium-sized cities happens in a way that avoids the pitfalls that we have seen in the growth of larger cities and mega cities with respect to their sustainability and their climate resilience.
Thanks, Stephen. I think there's a lot to unpack. I'll try to unpack some of it, and I'm sure my colleagues on the call will also add from their personal experience. I think one thing that the starting point really in urban planning is doing a baseline assessment. What do you have? Where do you want to build? Where do you not want to build? And the concept of these mappings, I think, have been maturing over time. So if we look, the concept of integrated development planning, at least in the Gulf, really started appearing explicitly in the early 2000s. In terms of implementation, when it first came out, it keeps on maturing. So you'd have, for example, an environmental map where you identify the ecologically sensitive areas. You kind of take them off the plan for development, create buffer zones. This is kind of very cliche approach to planning. And then what happened, I think this is the interesting bit, beyond just keeping what's environmentally sensitive, the way you'd approach it is maturing in terms of looking at overlaying your urban plan with your transport plan, with the infrastructure plan. Before it was either the roads would dictate a bit more where you'd build, or you'd set your mind where you'd want to have new developments. And I'm talking mostly GCC. In this example, I think the other Middle Eastern Levant cities are a bit older, so they kind of grew organically. I know Karim has a wealth of experience, so Karim, please correct me if you disagree, but I'm just drawing the picture from kind of being in the region for the past 15 years. I think that concept of integrated planning has really matured, and I think going forward, applying these lessons learned and really doing it in an integrated manner where, first of all, you really conserve what's very important in terms of natural assets, but you also forecast the changes in these natural assets, especially looking at, for example, sea level rise and climate change and increased flooding. So your flooding maps are probably very different where they were 20 years ago, where they are today, and we have better data to forecast what they're going to be in 20 years. And we have witnessed very severe floods with fatalities in the region over the past 2 decades that have taught, I think, civil servants to really consider these as major risks and plan accordingly. The risk planning is more mature, so that should be factored in beyond kind of the very simplistic way of looking at your environmental assets. And then the different layers of your urban systems are also more mature. And I think this ambition of climate transition is also maturing the thinking, in that traditionally you'd look at your population growth, you'd look at your electricity, water demand today and just multiply it by the population growth. And now you're having to factor in your demand side management, you're having to factor in what's my target and really squeeze in that in the development and your utilities planning. And it's a bit of a chicken and egg to see, do I have the right policies in today to meet these demands? Or do I also need to integrate or introduce new policies so that my power and water demand in 20 years, 25 years is not, it does meet my ambition. And I think, and maybe Shruti would also be able to add to this, I think the governance aspect, you talked about big cities, but also the smaller cities along the line. And I think mapping governance, who has the remit for the planning of these smaller cities across the line is a very big question mark, because a lot of these lessons learned have been learned in the bigger cities, in the regional governments, and whether they have the remit to plan for these smaller cities is a question mark. And ideally, you'd want the national governments to kind of take that kind of stewardship to take these lessons learned, which doesn't always happen. But yeah, ideally, this is, I think, there are lessons learned. Everybody did learn over the past 2 decades. So there is this knowledge, and ideally, you'd have this knowledge transferred across different governance pockets. I'd stop here and leave way for my colleagues to add.
Jamila, that's terrific. Thank you. Shruti, let me take her up on her invitation to you to, if there's anything you'd like to add to what Jamila was just talking about.
So Stephen, I think the way we look at it, C40, our starting point is that cities need to kind of pause and do a data-driven climate action planning exercise, right? I mean, it's very important for them to really understand how are their emissions translating into cross-sectoral impacts, right? Get data and get empowered by data, and then do a mapping of risks and governance, right? Which Jamila outlined. And it's very important that once you have a target-driven approach at looking at your climate action planning, you need to mainstream that, right? Because otherwise, these just kind of end up being academic reports, right? So it's very important to then look at how these get translated into the governance of the city, right? And that could be a small city or a large city or urban growth, but master planning is the document that is actually really able to project the urban growth and manage that, right? So it's very critical for cities to start integrating the two documents, in which we call mainstreaming. So to ensuring that cities have instruments and adequate frameworks of mainstreaming their climate actions with the growth patterns. So they're able to truly integrate and respond to risks. And these have to be looked at from a mitigation and adaptation perspective, right? So on one hand, you're trying to kind of lower and reduce your emissions, but on the other hand, you're also trying to balance that out with immediate risks, right? What are already locked in. So you really need the balance of that approach to be, able to kind of, that lens to be able to look at urban planning in cities. So I'll just, stop here for any kind of further questions or comments.
Great, thank you. I think we'll come back to several of those themes in a couple of our other questions throughout the discussion here today. I'd like to pull on something else that Jamila talked about a moment ago and ask you, Karim. So in terms of who has the remit for sort of driving the planning and doing that, so cities, sometimes can really sort of be policy agenda setters and models for the larger countries in which they are. Because they have economic and political power that can influence national policy, kind of beyond their own city boundaries. At the same time, they can also be constrained by national level policies. So where do you see prospects in the Middle East region for major cities to play a role in shaping the sustainable development policy at the larger national level? And how can we sort of in the other direction accelerate kind of decentralization of power so that smaller cities can pursue their own path with respect to how they respond to the unique conditions in those cities?
Sure. Well, thanks for that, and thanks for having me. So the region is quite an urban region. I think 2/3 of the population already live in urban areas. 65% of the MENA region's population lives in urban areas. It's where 70% of the energy is used. 2/3 of the emissions, or maybe up to 3/4 of the emissions, come from, and by large, most of the GDP is generated. So cities is basically where the region is, perhaps a little bit more than the global average, not as much as North America and Europe, but certainly above the global average. And it's quite central to all climate action. In an urban region, climate action, it will be basically about cities. Unfortunately, cities are hamstrung by the fact that they don't have any autonomy, and they lack powers. Globally, cities have the authority and the influence over just 33% of all climate action measures that they could do in order to reduce carbon emissions. So if you look at all the carbon reduction potential, cities just control 33% of that. And that is really a shame, given that they could potentially, with technically feasible solutions today, they could achieve 90% reduction of their own emissions. So the fact that cities don't control their own fate, despite being where we live and where we will feel most of the climate impacts anyways, is a real shame. And some would even argue that cities are where climate battles would be won or lost. So what is holding it back? Lack of competency in terms of powers, as you suggested, lack of ability to finance. Cities can't go out and seek financing easily. The World Bank has done a study on this and found that most cities cannot, and those who can do not seek financing. They don't have credit rating in the same way countries do as sovereign states. They lack technical competence in terms of the abilities of the staff. They don't, in some cases, they lack basic grant writing skills, and those are certainly getting in the way of cities achieving those. So empowering cities and collaborating with national governments, and that's the other thing, the layering and the overlapping of powers over certain measures, like say transportation, for example, or water and energy. That layering itself creates a certain competition that gets in the way of taking decisions that are pro-climate action. So empowering cities by national governments, bringing cities to the table of climate action, networks such as C40, of course, UCLG, GCOM, ICLEI, and the European Sustainable and Smart Cities Network. All of those attempt to give cities voice, give them agency, allow them to share knowledge and potentially pool some of their resources. That's all great, but cities still lack agency. They're still not major voices on climate action. They still talk to each other and have no, say, for example, control over climate change negotiations. And I've recently written about this a couple of weeks ago and called for cities, as we move away from negotiations into action, cities need to sit on the table and play a major role. Globally, it's where 2/3 of the population will live. Today, it's more than half of the population lives at the global scale. So why can they not voice their vision for climate action? Networks such as ICLEI or UCLG actually claims to speak on behalf of 3 billion people, and they're just lobbyists. They can't control their own destiny, and they still lack most of those powers in terms of control and in terms of finance. So I think cities unfortunately lack most of the powers that they need, despite the fact that they can do so much more than they do currently. And the solution would be an empowerment on all those points I mentioned.
That's really interesting, Karim. I want to see if either Jamila or Shruti can add anything to that. To what extent are we seeing efforts to do kind of capacity building for the competencies and other things that Karim talked about, or action on the political level to sort of increase that empowerment?
Maybe I'll let Shruti answer because they cover a much bigger, but after Shruti, I'd probably want to, being on the city side previously, all the constraints that Karim mentioned are real and they are hindering, but I think there are also things that cities could try to do, although they won't necessarily remedy the pains that Karim hinted at. But I'll let Shruti start.
Yeah, so I mean, I totally concur with what Karim outlined, Stephen, as issues, but just some examples, right? Because it's like a conundrum, right? Should we wait forever for cities to kind of get the power that they need to take action? Or should we then in parallel start working with whatever cities can do to take action, right? And I feel like we're more at the latter right now. So while we are, cities globally are expressing the need of getting more empowered in governance to take actions, but I think that shouldn't impede cities in taking action now, because we're losing time in action, right? We have 5 years. I mean, if you look at that, right? I mean, we just literally have 5 years to really be able to have some meaningful impact on greenhouse gas emissions. And that's hardly any time, right? So a couple of things that I want to outline. So C40, along with UCLG, has created this platform called the Urban 20, which is a part of the G20, which I'm sure the panelists are familiar with. But that's a global sort of diplomacy platform that follows the G20 presidency, where cities come together to actually look and evaluate what are their priorities, right? And they develop a communique that's handed to the G20 presidency. And increasingly, we are seeing the G20 presidency is getting more and more involved every cycle, right? I mean, I've seen in this cycle, because G20 presidency is with India right now, that almost every working group at the national government is addressing urbanization. And that's simply because of the fact that Karim outlined, and it's a known fact, right? Cities are economic drivers. No national government can sort of ignore the fact when they're looking at economic development, how are you structuring and focusing on cities, right? The second part is on financing. I mean, there is a very strong movement right now on multilateral development, sort of reforms. And I know that the new World Bank president has recently, in just the last couple of weeks, has really sort of come out very strong, in the Macron-Motley summit that just happened, in outlining how they would like to do reforms. And I've seen in this region, in the Southwestern Asia, which also looks at the Middle East, right, that I don't know if it's just the availability of finance that's the issue. I think it's about how do you create credit-worthy cities, right? How do you, so kind of giving cities adequate powers so that they can become more credit-worthy, and then looking at how risks can be taken, right? Like, how do you kind of look at who takes the risks for the cities when they're borrowing? And so for me, it's not, when we talk about financing, we always talk about the lack of financing. To me, I think there is money. I think it's just about structuring the right frameworks where the cities can borrow is very critical. So I really feel like it's correct. Cities need more power. But I think we really need to focus on what cities can do right now to nudge actions, to take their own actions, to create like many, many things that they can do on, smaller aspects of resilience, etc. But also then nudge and be on global diplomacy platforms like the Urban 20, UN Secretary General, like the, assemblies, all of these forums to outline what they need. So I'll just stop here because, I mean, it's a debate that's very sort of, active.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Jamila, I saw you were nodding when she said.
Yeah, nodding and then not nodding. Yeah, I think about in finance, you have this like kind of triple qualifier. It's availability, access, and quality, right, of finance. And you hear, I mean, the 2 points that were raised by Karim and Shruti are very valid in that there's very often there's a skills gap at the local level to produce to structure projects, to express projects in a way that's acceptable to the financiers, but also the funding packages that are made available by the financiers don't meet the demands of cities, right? This is also another issue. And very often when we talk about cities, and going back to your first question about the smaller cities, so, you know, like the Tokyos and the New Yorks, they will be heard, yes or no. Maybe they won't be fully empowered as they could be, but it's the smaller cities. I mean, I don't know, I'll tell you, like Batroun in Lebanon, or little cities, unless they're really exceptional, and that they get the limelight that then gives them political push and at a national and international level. You have these smaller cities that are forgotten, that are not voiced even at the national level sometimes, and don't really have much of a chance at an international level. And going back to what they can do, I think all the demands that were raised by Karim and Shruti will remain demands until they're met, and we won't progress as an urban agenda until they're given empowerment. But looking at, I mean, when I was a city practitioner, we did look at what we could do at a local level. I think the UAE is a bit special because a lot of cities are state cities, so the city comes with regulatory power, which is not often the case. But what I did witness that I think is applicable to any city is the convening power, the power to bring private sector together, making data available. And we still have a lot to improve in the Middle Eastern region about data availability, but just putting data on the table, sharing it between across sectors, between private sector, just giving you an example, between developers, designers, contractors, and then utility providers. If you just share data, you could optimize design efficiencies, right? I mean, if a designer is putting specifications and you don't know what is the latest performance in terms of, I don't know, electricity and water usage for commercial space, and you're still using data that are 10 years old, you're missing optimization tools, right? And this any city can do, regardless of whether they have funding or not. You could do it on a volunteering basis. That's one thing. In terms of retail and consumerism and kind of waste data, you could, again, bring people together, create a momentum, give visibility incentives, you know, just celebrating them through an event. And they seem very petty, small examples, but they can move local markets, okay, regardless of whether you have power for regulation, etc. So I think the things that in the smaller scheme of things, because the bigger scheme is what my colleagues have already mentioned, in the smaller scheme of things, you can move markets at a local level. You can create efficiencies and improvements by creating these platforms of cross-fertilization. Yeah, I'll stop there, but it's just to put a bit of optimism. Yeah.
That's good, and it's good to have examples, obviously, of these things we're talking about. I want to shift gears a little bit. We've been talking about cities as entities, if you will. I'm going to go back to something Karim said earlier. Cities are where we live, right? It's where the people live. So let's talk a little bit about the people in these cities. It's difficult to think about the future of cities in the Middle East or anywhere. Difficult to think about them being sustainable cities if we don't think about what a just transition to a green energy and economy and reduced resource consumption, but think about what that looks like and how we realize it. So this is, to any of you, what are some of the most important and the most urgent steps that leaders today need to start taking to make a just transition viable in the cities of the Middle East and North Africa and the region as a whole? I don't know if Karim, you want to start, or anybody want to take that?
I'll have a go. So cities, existing cities, large-scale cities, are quite difficult to retrofit, quite difficult to change. Some of the basic principles that cities should aspire to develop is transit-oriented development, for example, weaving in the public transportation network into a car-dependent city. Some of the really important themes is green and blue infrastructure, getting that integrated, walkability and bikeability. And these are really simple words, but really complicated things to integrate into existing cities. It's a different matter for smaller cities trying to grow or new development that didn't exist before. In often case, master planners find opportunities to do so in locations that are perhaps less privileged, and perhaps in locations where there are more informalities under the guise of upgrading those. So often, case one finds that the least privileged amongst us are the ones who lose out from regeneration. It's quite a common thing in the Middle East and North Africa, especially in the Levant and North Africa specifically, where we see larger areas of informalities, and they're deemed to be an eyesore that needs to be removed. So rather than rehabilitating it, it's often raised down, and in the interest of putting major new infrastructure. And that infrastructure could be really efficient. It could provide sustainability, it could provide resilience, and it could improve the overall operations of the city. Unfortunately, it comes without justice, and that's certainly one way in which we see that taking place within the region. And I think that's one example. I'll leave it to others to chip in on that point as well.
Shruti, I'm interested to hear what you would add to that.
Yeah, sorry. So the way we look at it, Stephen, is that more than probably 50% of the workforce in the Middle East is informal. They work, in informal sectors, outdoors, often. And with the current, I'm just sort of setting the stage of why just transition is sort of really critical, right? And in the current heat waves that we're seeing and increasing, they're the most impacted, right? And this is a challenge that is cross-sectoral. It's not like one thing, right? I think this is a part of how you're looking at the lens of climate action, and accelerating that has to have vulnerable population that includes everyone, right? Like children, adults, people below poverty line, disabled, everybody, like people who are working outside. And how do you create strategies for those people, right? Like everybody, and they're integrated into the transition to green. So the couple of examples that I want to give is that for C40, every climate action plan that we develop is based on inclusive climate action. We ensure that we have every sort of stakeholder on the table to decide what kind of strategies are required in a cross-sectoral way. That's number one, right? So there's ownership on the climate action plan. The other aspect on just transition is also important on job creation, right? Like, for example, we're looking at electrification. How do you ensure that the transition of people who are working on ICE vehicles is happening? What kind of skilling, upskilling measures are being provided? Then from a risk perspective, what about this workforce that is working outside? What are the mechanisms and ways that we are addressing them in looking at climate adaptation or resilience, right? Like people on coasts, people working in heat. What are the mechanisms that we are sort of creating within the city climate action plans to ensure that they are protected? So it's very critical that we are able to account for all this, because the impacts of this are great, right? We've seen significant climate migration happening across the Middle East, right? Because of this issue. And how do you settle those people who are coming in? Through climate migration, how are you able to account for that and also, mitigate migration from climate? So those are some points that I would want to make.
That's terrific, and you both have touched a couple of things. Some work that our strategic foresight program did last year on electric mobility in the region, the upskilling of people, seeing the shift to new forms of mobility and new forms of energy as a job creation opportunity, and is some of the things that we surfaced in that work. Jamil, I'll give you an opportunity if you want to add anything here before we move on to another question.
The point about migrants, I don't have much to add about the just energy transition, but I think amongst all of that, just tracking the plight of migrants, and there are quite a bit in the MENA region as well, is I think not always explicitly addressed in city plans. Sometimes it becomes an afterthought, but then they stay. And I don't know, I haven't seen a lot of proactive integration of migrants or internally displaced people in urban plans. And I think this is something overall that climate plans globally, not only in our region, are a bit lagging behind, integrating accounting for internally displaced people and migrants. And through a recent discussion with somebody in UNHCR and asking them about how could you really strengthen or at least make these migrant people more resilient, one of the direct answers was strengthening and making more resilient the host city and the host countries. And I remember an article that Karim wrote, I think a couple of years ago, and it was the first time that I saw real like forecasting or at least expectation that if something happened in, and I forgot, Karim, you'd remember it, if something happened in Egypt, then it would impact these other countries or these other cities. And you don't have a lot of this type of forecasting, especially not in our field, maybe in the humanitarian side. But I think there needs to be much more cross-fertilization again and integrated planning, including humanitarian impacts and climate impacts in our city resilience plans.
I don't remember what I wrote, but Stephen is the foresight
It
expert.
was very,
So I think
it
you
was
should talk to
very
him.
eye-opening.
And this question of internally displaced people and migrants is something I'd like to come back to before we run out of time a little while from now. Data has come up several times in what you all have talked about in response to the first few questions. So and sort of technology in general, sort of advanced technology. So the vision that we've seen developing over the last decade or more, last couple of decades of smart cities. Is one that's very rooted in data and data analytics and fourth industrial revolution technologies like artificial intelligence and Internet of Things. What are some of the benefits for sustainability and for climate resilience that these kinds of technologies potentially can promise? And there's a flip side to that as well. I mean, all these technologies have some risks inherent in them. How can some of those risks and threats of these kinds of technologies, as we're doing urban development and trying to develop smart cities, how can some of those risks be forestalled? Shruti, would you like to take that?
Sure. I'll definitely try to address it. So just to give you an example, I was recently reading an article about Bangladesh, right, where they were predicting a very heavy flash flood, which is going to impact the crops. But the way the bordering states got this information is through sort of India, where they had informal WhatsApp channels, which informed them about this flash flood. And then they were able to kind of use, their informal mechanisms on ground to inform the farmers to sort of, protect the crops and protect their houses and find shelter. Now, the analysis was that if data or weather forecasting could be shared in advance between cities and countries that predict all of this, and then find integration within emergency response systems, you could actually manage some of the climate risks in a more sustainable and comprehensive way, right, in advance. So I think, so that's one example. Then second is even just kind of the data-driven greenhouse gas emission inventories that we do. Cities today may be doing many things on climate action, but don't really know what their targets are, what they're doing to achieve it. So it's very important to have that data-driven approach for political decision-making, prioritization, for accessing finance. So I think data is empowering. It's very, very important as we're going into understanding mitigation and adaptation. And these two sort of examples cover the fact of, how you look at mitigation and adaptation and are able to really build the importance of data. And I mean, one can talk about this forever, right? So I'm going to sort of just kind of also go to the flip side of it. The challenge is that in the region of the Middle East, the access to data is maybe about 20% of people have real access to like 4G, 5G technology, right? many people don't understand data. It's again something that rests with a certain percentage of the population. And we really saw the impact of this in COVID, where people were forced to move to mobile phones for their education. And we saw that there was a significant drop, right? Because people didn't have access in this region of phones, of mobile phones, or of high internet services, in certain parts of the city. And again, this is a question of inclusion. So I think data has a very, very important role to play in empowering us in our fight on climate change and action by really empowering cities. But the flip side is that it has to really look at the access of who has the data, how it's getting controlled, who will get empowered to use it, and what would be the use of it. So I think that's sort of what I want to sort of set the stage for in the use of data.
Well, it's interesting you bring up the dimension of the access of the citizens of these cities to the data, and that's an important piece of this that we need to take into account. The governments of these cities also, I think we need to take note of. There's so much data that they have that they're collecting just in the day-to-day operations of the cities, traffic management and everything else, and to what extent it is thought of using that data for sort of climate action planning rather than just traffic management, just as an example. Kareem, I don't know if is there anything you'd like to add on this question?
One quick thing before I just hand it to Kareem is this thing that we learned is that cities are drowning in information, but are lacking knowledge, right? Because they get so much different data that's disaggregate, but there's very little ability for them to kind of trend it, understand what it is. So I think it's important to be able to empower them to think about sort of that trending of the data to really be able to understand how do you create evidence. Oh, sorry, over to Kareem.
Oh, thank you. You've covered most of it. I find smart city technologies to be a service that can help both sustainability and resilience, which is shorthand for climate change mitigation and adaptation, loosely speaking. So in terms of mitigation, it's great in terms of improving efficiency of energy use in general. That you can do that in mobility. It supports public transportation by providing more data. It tells you where the next bus is, makes people wait for the bus. It allows you to cram more trains on the train line, which encourages more ridership. So in the bigger picture, leads to less car rides and therefore less energy, fossil fuel, less emissions. It also allows you to provide data in real time on the adaptation/resilience side, which is great for disaster risk reduction, is great for early warning systems. So if it tells you there's a dust storm coming in, you'll be a little bit better prepared for that, and the city operations could potentially do a little bit better. So from that perspective, I see a lot of benefits, but technology is technology. It's whatever you use it for, and it is used for all kinds of reasons. And I believe that resilience is one agenda, sustainability is another agenda, digitization is a completely separate agenda, and the evangelists, if you like, of each agenda are very different in what their goals are. So if they provide a technology that is useful for us, that isn't about surveillance, perhaps, then perhaps we'll find opportunities to make that of use. But in many cases, one finds that smart city has somehow taken over the drive for sustainability, because no one wants a stupid city, right? So everyone wants a smart city. So smart city technologies and the buzz they create have, in a way, undermined the sustainability agenda just because of the hype of the technology, regardless of what the technology serves. So there's just a word of caution there.
No, I think you're absolutely right. It's we can become fascinated with the sort of very high-end uses of technologies, and to come back to people, right? It's what are those technologies doing for the people who live in those cities, and surveillance and other sort of darker side potential uses of these technologies and data itself is something we need to take into account. I want to remind our audience members, you have the opportunity, if you would like, to post questions in the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. We have a couple of questions already there that we will make sure we have time to get to. But if anybody else has questions they would like to add, please go ahead and use that Q&A button, and we'll make time to do those. I have one other question that I would like to pose to all of you before we switch to the audience questions. And it comes back to one of the things you talked about a few minutes ago, Jamil, about people who are displaced internally and migrants. And again, we're talking a lot about sort of the larger cities. We talked earlier about the smaller ones, but building climate resilience and sustainability and green housing into cities is one thing, and that's the primary topic of our discussion here today. But peri-urban areas and rural communities and informal settlements, areas with displaced people, all of those were a part of an important focus at COP27. And I want to spend a few minutes here to hear your thoughts on what are some of the most essential actions that governments and the finance and development and private sector communities could take and need to take over the next 5 to 10 years to bring sustainability planning and climate resilience planning into these sort of ex-urban areas and more rural areas. Shruti, would you like to maybe take that on?
Sure. Jamila, I saw you put your mic. You want to go first, or?
I can go second. Fine, don't worry. Go ahead.
So thank you, Stephen. I think it's a very, very important question, right? Because while, doing or accelerating climate action requires everybody to be on the table, right? In a country, it's the cities, the mega cities, the tier 2, tier 3 cities, the peri-urban rural areas. And I think it's very important as decision makers to also see, why do people come to cities? It's for economic engines and growth opportunities, right? And that's what's increasing the urbanization and putting the stress on cities. I think finding mechanisms where we're able to create opportunities, even in tier 2, tier 3 cities, and empower people that they don't feel the urge or the need to move to cities to get those services, right? Like, for example, education, healthcare, like financial services, etc. As I think, to me, would be a basis of looking at that, right? Because that would solve the first principal problem of urbanization. It's a hard one, but I think it requires that thinking through of how do you do that. The second point is that nothing in the discussion of climate change is isolated, right? It's all interconnected. Cities are not isolated urban areas. They rely on services, people, agriculture, food, on others, right? So I think it's important when cities or national governments are thinking of climate action that they need to expand that thinking to their metropolitan regions and also cover like the rural areas that are their catchment areas, right? And how are they able to create that support of these areas, in terms of, let's say, like food supplies or water or energy and all of these sort of systems, that are interconnected, to ensure that we're building resilience, not only because you cannot build resilience of just the cities, right? I think that's the concept that we need to get out of, right? Like we need to understand that it's an interconnected ecosystem and that needs to be handled in an interconnected way. So I think, to me, that's very important in looking at how do you handle these areas.
Excellent. Jamil, I know you have some thoughts you wanted to share on this to build somewhat.
Yeah, I'll just add probably to Shruti. I think it is a very difficult problem to solve, and it's very difficult to manage informal settlements. Most informal settlements don't get a permit. So how do you even start managing or controlling these informal settlements if there is no entry point to start managing that? And I think the first point is really minimizing risk and increasing resilience. So if they are building, you'd look, a lot of people would start building in floodplains or places that are risky. I mean, the minimum to do is try to find alternative pathways and or alternative locations, and then support in that transition. And a lot of times it is a financial burden, and financing becomes a very big hiccup, which we already discussed. I mean, we're struggling to get finance to cities, let alone financing to informal settlements. I think point number one would be risk mitigation, risk management, and you really have to work with the local communities. I think there's a really good example with Sheila Patel and Roof Over Our Heads, who is working with informal settlements to increase resilience there. But it is a very specific business model that cannot be just copy pasted. You know, it has to be born within the community, tailored to the community, to the local governance and the local players. For this local led action is super critical to enable that. And this is why you need intermediary players that would act between the big financiers or big policymakers and local actors, which is where a lot of times you have NGOs come into play.
Great, thank you for that. Karima, if you have anything you want to add, I'll give you the opportunity before we move on to questions from our audience.
I'll highlight the problem a little bit more in terms of the Middle East. I mean, they've already covered most of the solutions, most of the proposed solutions. But the challenge in the MENA region is that cities in every country, they're developed. One city has developed into what we call the prime city, which is a city that represents a large share of the total population of the state. And when it achieves that point, this is where the jobs become, and this is where everyone is drawn to. And unfortunately, with the rate of urbanization being as high as it is in North Africa and in the Levant, you get this rapid urbanization in a city unable to provide the basic services for it. I mean, that's not factoring in conflict or war or any of the other additional challenges that drive people further into cities or drought. So the population finds itself drawn to a city that no longer provides the efficiencies, the environmental benefits through agglomeration, network effect, or economies of scale that cities are supposed to provide to people. And this is why people come to cities. They no longer do that, but it's all the only place where work is. So in an ironic twist, if you like, the cities are like the fire to the moth. They're drawn to it only to be burned by it. And unfortunately, we need to slow down or find alternatives for these populations being drawn to the dysfunctional, less optimal cities by, as Shruti has pointed out, by providing alternatives to where they live. Not everyone needs to move into the prime city or into a city in the first place. And once we provide additional economic opportunities, perhaps not moving to the city might be the best option. The global urbanization project will continue, and it will end by the end of the century, where most of us will live in a city. Yes, but in this region, which is already urban, we could slow down a little because cities are not providing the promise that they are supposed to provide.
No, I think that's an important note to end on with respect to this question, to really bring it back to some of the unique conditions, if you will, of this particular region of the world. So thank you for that. In the time remaining, we have a couple of questions from the audience. So let me look up here. So there's thanks to all of you for your remarks here, and a couple of questions. The first is, can you give, and they're not directed to any of you individually, so any of you who want to take these, please jump in. Can you give specific examples of city development adapting effectively to rapidly changing environments? I would think that could, be any from climate conditions themselves. I'm kind of reading into the question to migration patterns or anything where the developments are kind of changing rapidly.
In the region or globally? It doesn't say, does it?
It doesn't say. Why don't we start with the region, but take it where you think it's important for us to hear
So
your thoughts.
it's a question about climate adaptation in cities and what successful examples have there been for that. I think the one interesting example that comes to mind right now is the Chinese concept of sponge cities, not applicable to the MENA region, but it is in direct response to the increased precipitation due to climate change. So you get more rainfall, and when the rainfall comes in, it's quite intense, and the cities need to somehow delay, attenuate that stormwater, that rainwater, and deal with it as slowly as possible. So this concept of a sponge city with significant green-blue infrastructure has emerged, and many Chinese cities has become state policy for urban areas. And that approach allows the city to absorb this increased rainfall, climate-driven increased rainfall, and slowly dissipate it into the ground or into the water courses. So that's perhaps one example. What would the region do with an increased temperature or reduced precipitation around the Mediterranean? What would it do with dust storms, etc.? There has not been a successful example to the same level across the region that we can point to and say that's a great climate adaptation measure that has been integrated into MENA cities, unfortunately.
Great, thank you. I don't know if Jamila or Shruti, if you have anything you want to add to that.
Maybe I can just give two quick additions to that, right? I mean, we've seen one important aspect to consider is that we're seeing cities that are facing the heat stress, now looking at really addressing, quickly, rapidly trying to address that through heat action plans. So we've seen like chief heat officers get appointed, like Athens has one, recently Dhaka North has appointed one that's looking at a more holistic way of cities sort of planning, in how they address the heat, which is a cross-sectoral issue. Bangladesh, for example, in Dhaka North, I mean, because of the increasing salinity in the water, they've actually been adapting, creating this farming on floating farms, right? So that's like a quick adaptation of how they're dealing with salt water, increasing, and also kind of looking at some sort of, villages there where there is no water and sort of adopting technologies of, storing rainwater that immediately gets filtered through this very innovative sort of tank technology. So just kind of seeing how quickly, cities are adapting to changes that are coming about.
Thank you. We have another question, unless Jamila, you have anything you want to add on this one? Okay.
No, it's fine. Thank you.
Okay, our other question here, again, to any of you, not to any one of you specifically, interested in, do you have any ideas or thoughts on better managing industrial parks for pollution monitoring? So I mean, people live in cities, but obviously also there are large-scale industrial operations, corporate and other going on in many cities in the region and around the world also. So examples you've seen or thoughts on better managing industrial parks for pollution monitoring?
But I can start. I think the first point, it goes back to data. I mean, you can't manage unless you start monitoring. And we've seen some cities, for example, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, have kind of a bit of monitoring stations, Sharjah as well, which is a starting point. So once you know that you have a problem, then you start putting either local or very often you'd have federal regulations on air pollution thresholds that are allowed, and sometimes some of the regions or local regulators then put an additional layer of regulations. Then after data, the second difficult part is the inspections part, and having on-spot inspections, adequate inspections. And an enabling tool is the complaint system. So if you allow complaints to happen, then this kind of nudges the inspectors to go inspect, and it's kind of a self-reinforcing reinforcing mechanism. There are good examples of implementation, and I can state, for example, I mean, Dubai, Abu Dhabi have decent, like have quite good mechanisms. There's always room for improvement, and also that does require local capabilities and financing to maintain that system. But I think it's a system with different components. Yeah.
Great. I don't know if either of you, Shruti or Karim, have anything to add on that. Or let me, as we're kind of coming up on time here, if any of the three of you have any just last remarks you want to make about things that we have not brought up.
On the question, just to say that I would recommend to the person who's asked the question to refer to the UNIDO, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, to refer to their Sustainable Industrial Parks Strategy Initiative, and it's their urban industrial initiative. I think there's plenty of lessons to be learned there in terms of overall sustainable development approach, as well as then the synergies with cities and pollution.
Excellent, thank you. Again, if any of you have any last remarks you'd like to make on anything we haven't touched on before I turn it back over to Mohammed Mahmoud. All right, well, we'll do that then. Mohammed, let me hand it back to you to close out our panel and our Climate Week.
Thanks, Stephen. I think our panel has said all that they could say on the topic, and very well. So I'll just mention a few things that resonated with me, just to chime in on the discussion. I appreciated the commentary on the role of cities and how to empower them for climate action while simultaneously mitigating the risks that cities face. I like the point that was made, drawing the distinction between the objectives of sustainability and resilience may not necessarily be aligned at certain intersections. And then I also appreciated this conversation about data, how integrating data and mainstreaming data more comprehensively into city planning and adaptation and mitigation is helpful. I think Jamila mentioned it, but it reminds me of the comment, you can't manage what you can't measure. And there is an issue of access to data. This was also mentioned actually in our first panel on Monday on environmental sustainability and water management, that the physical monitoring networks in the region are quite poor and less dense and sparse compared to other parts of the world, just in terms of physical types of data, hydrometeorological data, that type of information. So I'm glad this topic also reared its head here. So with that, I wanted to thank all of you. Thank you, Stephen, for moderating this session quite masterfully. Our panelists, Jamila, Karim, Shruti, very experienced voices and depth of knowledge. So I really appreciate your participation and time. This essentially brings our Climate Week event to a close. I just want to kind of briefly recap the week. I know audiences here, but also this session, much like all the previous sessions, have been recorded. I know we have an international audience, so our viewership may not necessarily be mostly live. A lot of it is coming from repeat viewing. So this will be posted, much like the other sessions, on YouTube, as well as on the event page itself, where folks came on to register. But just to recap the week, I'd mentioned, on Monday, we talked about water management, environmental sustainability. Some of those issues also popped here today in terms of some of the challenges the region is facing as far as water scarcity, both on water supply and water demand side. Our second day looked at climate action, climate activism and youth engagement, and the role that young people are playing in the region as far as moving the climate agenda forward, positioning the MENA region within the Global South. And then on our third day, looking at the intersection of both climate and security and how that trickles into various areas, both in terms of water issues, food security, and even urban environments, our topic for today. And then yesterday, we focused on energy transition and the green circular economy with a keynote from Her Excellency Dr. Nawal Hosseini, the UAE's permanent representative in IRENA, and obviously energy transition and energy topics as it pertains to climate mitigation is a big component as we look ahead, feeding into COP28 later this year. So thank you again to our audience. Thank you again to our panelists. Really appreciate it. I think this brings a nice close to our week. Of course, all of the videos are available to view at any time once we conclude. So thank you all so very much and take care for now.
Thank you.